God, what was even the last Sega CD game I did? Was it Earthworm Jim, I want to say?
Metro City, a well-known crime capital, has been ruled by violence and death for many years. A fact which the newly elected mayor and former street fighter Mike Hager plans to change. At the center of the problem is the huge gang known as Mad Gear. Mad Gear controls all of the major criminal activity in the city. When they learned of Hager's plans, they took immediate action to bring this new mayor under their control. Sometime in 1992.
Hello, Mike Hager here.
Hee, Mr. Hager. So pleased to make your acquaintance. I believe you know who I am. Don't hang up. We have a little business proposition for you. Your daughter for your cooperation. And we'll throw in the regular monthly bonus to your salary we offered before.
What? What happened to Jessica? Who is this?
Not so fast, Mike. Turn on your TV.
You son of a... What have you done to her?
Nothing yet, but we'd enjoy the opportunity. Listen to reason, man. Why make your job difficult? Just let us do as we please, like the mayor before you did.
Guy, Jessica was kidnapped.
Jessica?
My sweetheart since childhood.
The Mad Gear must pay. She's my friend too. Count me in.
That is some good 90s ham. Hello everyone and welcome to Let's Play Final Fight CD. I've been meaning to touch on this series for a little while now. Before we get into the game itself though, I'm coming in here to the options menu to change my controls around and increase my life count. And I should have actually gone to the extra lives to change it to the option where you get some every certain amount of points, because even on normal mode, which I'm playing on because to my memory this game doesn't give you anything for playing on higher difficulties, this game can kick your ass. Like with a lot of beat-em-ups, we have a choice of which character we can play as, though. This is actually one of the main differences depending on which home console version you're playing, but I'll talk more about that in a few moments. Brass tacks is Guy is quicker on his feet but a little lower on damage, Cody's generally in the middle, whereas Hagar is a little bit slower, but he's ultimately a powerhouse, and that's the main reason I really like to play as him, despite his, to my memory, also larger hitbox. So, this game's just your general beat-em-up in a lot of regards. Go through stages, beat a bunch of enemies up, destroy things in your way to get items or weapons to use along the way. Do your best to survive, especially as enemies gang up on you. We also have the usual techniques you can do. Got your punches and your grapples you can do. You have a special attack you can either press a separate button for if you select an option to do so, or you can just press the jump and attack button at the same time. For instance, with Hagar, it's a lariat that has extraordinary invincibility frames and range. But its damage to my memory isn't the highest, but if you connect with your special attack, you do lose health. So be careful where you use it. Before I get into more with this topic, this next screen is big flashing lights warning, because it is extremely flickery. Thankfully, it's not a very long screen, but be careful all the same. Going back to the special attack, with Hagar in specific. His lariat is again good for getting out of certain boss fight attacks via invincibility frames or just getting out of them period, but it's especially good if you're surrounded by enemies, which even on normal mode, this game really likes to do, so be careful with that. That right there, though, is the main reason I like to play as Hagar. He's a grappler. You can do a lot more suplexes and jump powered bombs with him than any of the other characters. And you're, I think to my memory, almost completely invincible doing so. So not only are you keeping an enemy out of your way by, you know, flipping them over into other enemies, but you're also effectively a cannonball yourself, making him very good to just get through standard enemies. Although at the same time, this is still a beat 'em up, which means they're gonna throw as much as they can at you, and some enemies just have some pretty ridiculous ranges, hitboxes, and speeds. The good thing is, though, and we will see this towards the end of the game, this is one of those games where getting a game over doesn't reset the stage until you're out of continues. You'll just drop right in where you were. It does act like the arcade game in that regard. For right now, though, it's time for our first boss fight, Thrasher. He's a bit weird in that he actually calls in backup at certain points early on in his health bar. And his is also the first health bar we're seeing that is not yellow into red. That just means they have an overflow of health. That can go from blue all the way into, I think, white. And it'll just get more and more fragmented the further into it you get. It's not the best way to read it, though. I've never really liked older beat-em-ups that did this general thing with their health bars. I'd rather they just even put like a number next to it so I can go, okay, they have 2 health bars left. Because you have no idea how far towards the red and yellow health bar you are with that. That's just my personal tastes, admittedly. Thrasher jumps around a lot, of course, as we've already seen, and this can make him pretty hard to catch up with when he's not trying to kick into you. My one advice, though, is to stay away from that door in the back, as enemies will spawn through, as we already saw, and I think more can spawn as you go through. The big thing is, watch out for those enemies that can come in from the side that are red and throw dynamite, because that dynamite, while it can damage the bosses and enemies, can also damage you pretty heavily, so watch out for that. And we're already done with stage 1. With that said, if you're used to the Super Nintendo versions, you might notice something about that map that seems a little off. So let's get into why I'm playing the Sega CD release. For one thing, the playable characters. When Final Fight originally released on the arcade version, it had all 3 playable characters we saw earlier, but when they ported it to Super Nintendo, they took out Guy, so it was just a Cody and Hagar game. They then made a Final Fight Guy version that, on top of some other things, replaced Cody with Guy and gave a plot synopsis for why he wasn't even in the game, to my memory, but left Hagar there. This having all 3 playable characters means technically in that regard it's the truest the arcade release. For another thing, there is also an outright stage removed in the Super Nintendo versions. I think it's the 5th stage we encounter in the Sega CD versions and arcade releases. For a third thing, and honestly this is the most important one to me, outside of the couple of cutscenes we got that actually have voice acting, the soundtrack. I love the Sega CD versions of these songs. They're so strong. The instrumentation it can be a little bit generic, admittedly, because there's a lot of instruments I recognize from, say, PC Engine games at the time. But it's still just such a good soundtrack. Notably, though, this technically doesn't have the most cutscenes out of any version of Final Fight 1. Final Fight got ported to the Game Boy Advance under the title Final Fight 1, as in the word 1, spelling out the number. And they actually added small little cutscenes before every boss fight, which is pretty neat, but due to that, I almost ended up playing that version for this LP. The main reason I didn't is, for one thing, the visuals of the Game Boy Advance version I'm not the biggest fan of. Primarily the fact that there's enough screen crunch where the camera has to scroll in places it doesn't in the other home releases in a way that I found distracting. And for another thing, the soundtrack. Not that Final Fight on the Game Boy Advance's soundtrack is bad. If anything, I actually prefer it to the Super Nintendo tracks in terms of the energy. It's just that it's not this version's soundtrack, and I prefer this one so much. Now, as is the standard for beat-em-ups, there aren't that many enemy types in this game, but you fight a lot of them in mobs of, at times, 10s in a row pretty quickly. Like with most others, the ones you need to watch out for are the mini-boss types, like the Axles here that are very guard-heavy, or especially the Andres and Andre Juniors, which, gee, I wonder which wrestler they're referencing, as they are beefy, but they can also charge at you basically at a frame's notice, and reacting to that can be tough, frankly. That is part of why I like Hagar, because again, I could do the grapples or the pile drives to potentially get around that. There's also the, I forget the name of the enemy type, but it's the guys that wear the bandanas and throw the knives. They're annoying because for one thing, they have, I think, the highest range for any normal enemy type in the game, or I guess mini-boss type. They can just hit you from effectively a body length away at times, it seems like, depending on the character. And that can be frustrating, which I think at times describes this game to begin with. Thankfully, they do place a good amount of health items along the way in the levels in this, I find, compared to some other beat-em-ups. On top of that, most of the mobs don't take that many hits to take out, unless they get very guard-happy. But on top of that, again, this game does do what is effectively a pretty standard thing in beat-em-ups to this day, where if you die, the moment you die, enemies get thrown to the floor so you don't just get spawn camped. And using that to your advantage in some cases can actively be very effective for managing crowds. Especially if you're playing the game two-player, which I'm not, and I honestly originally planned to. Like I said, I've been meaning to do this LP for a while. I think in my notes, I have a version of this written down as early as like 2018, but I just never got to it because the person I wanted to play it with, Scott, who is on some older LPs in the channel, we just both got extraordinarily busy with life. I was in the middle of like college and all that. He was working a full-time job, and things just didn't work out that way. And now that I've moved further away, doing stuff with him to begin with is already really hard, and God, I miss my buddy. But here I am doing the LP anyway, and it's partially to resolve an arc from an earlier LP. A little bit ago, it was about maybe half a year, maybe closer to a year ago at this point, I LP'd Joe and Mac for the Super Nintendo. And I mentioned that LP, my first exposure to that game was via a book we had growing up alongside Zardion. I thought it was the little tips and tricks book, and it effectively is in what it actually was, but we couldn't find out what it was by the time I finished that LP. And just to have it in video, we figured it out. It was the Play Action Strategy Super Nintendo Guidebook, which is roughly like 70-page little magazine that has little tips and tricks for about 20 Super Nintendo games scattered throughout it, like Mario World, Castlevania 4, Zardion, as I mentioned, Joe and Mac. And this, the Super Nintendo version of this game, is featured in that, and that was the first way I was actually exposed to Final Fight. Having read it over again a couple days ago, the section on this game isn't very in-depth. It kind of just talks about the mechanics, power-ups, and all that, the differences between the two playable characters in the base release. But that book, I remember very fondly as it's how I got a look into a lot of games that I just really wanted to play at the time and just couldn't because we didn't have copies of it. Super Ghouls and Ghosts was another one of those at the time, I believe. And that's just, it's good to finally have that noted, because it is a really, it's a very weirdly core memory of my childhood. For now, though, it's time for the second boss, Katana. Worth noting at this point, a lot of the bosses got their names changed in the home console releases. For instance, Thrasher's name was Damned in the arcade release, whereas I believe Katana here was Sodom? So, Katana can be a rough boss for damage, on top of the fact that he has two swords that you can knock out of his hands, which means you can also use them for high damage. His attack pattern changes depending on whether or not he has both of his swords or not. When he has both of them, he moves pretty slowly, can be easily grappled, and tries to hit you from pretty long ranges, albeit when he does hit you, it really hurts. When he has, I think, either one or none, he's a lot faster and relies on a very invincible dash attack to get around and do damage to you, which can drain your health really quickly. Doing some jump kicks like that can get him into a good combo state here and again, but if anything, I'd recommend hitting him, making him drop one of his swords, letting him pick it back up, and then going back in for another grapple with Hagar or something like that, just to keep him in a good lock. Otherwise, you can be in danger in this fight very quickly. With that said, as for my history with Final Fight, the Play Action Strategy Super Nintendo Guidebook was the first time I saw it, but I don't think I really got to play the game in depth actually until the Game Boy Advance release. I didn't own it. I think another kid and I traded games for our Game Boy Advances while we were on the road to a field trip at one point, so I played a stage or two of it then, whereas I think they messed around in Mega Man Zero, I want to say. I think after that, I didn't play the classic versions of it until either I started messing around with emulators or maybe the Wii Virtual Console, one or the other. So if you're a fan of a certain other Capcom series, this special stage probably looks a little familiar. You can destroy the car. You can hit it in the top left of the roof, the top right, or in the hood. The more you beat it up, the more points you get, which is useful for, of course, high score bragging rights, but also to get extra lives depending on the options you've selected. The pipe is there to help with certain characters, but Hagar can just tear into the car, no problem. But yeah, this actually leads well into what I was going to talk about. This bonus stage is ripped right out of Street Fighter. For a good reason, the two series are completely canon with each other. I forget the exacts of it, I'll look into it before I do the second editing pass, but if memory serves, Final Fight started development as a sequel to the original Street Fighter. And then they've just been completely canon with each other since, to the point where I'd say most people around my age are probably more familiar with Final Fight characters as the Street Fighter playables they became. Like, I know Hagar, Cody, alongside several others are in 4. I think there may have been one of the alpha games off the top of my head, or at least mentioned in it. And they are still actively talked about, I believe, in Street Fighter 6 from what I've seen. I still have yet to play that because, frankly, there's so many RPGs on my plate, playing a fighting game just isn't on the docket anytime soon. Oh, I also probably should have mentioned this back in Stage 1. So I'm, of course, playing the Sega CD release, and we entered the options menu, and I increased my life count and all that, but I didn't change the difficulty. There is an options menu in the Super Nintendo release, but you actually have to press a code to unlock the ability to use it. I believe on the title screen it is LR Start and Select, and from there you can change the difficulty and life count, whatever you need to do. Honestly, I always am a fan of boosting my lives to max and to beat 'em up, just in case, as a lot of the time the base life count is meant to be either for quarter munching on an arcade release, or to more incentivize rentals to an extent. Plus, I won't lie, for recording, it makes the game a little more streamlined, and I don't have to redo as much, albeit, again, with this game's continue system as being as kind as it is. It's not the worst to get a game over in a stage. Although, if memory serves, you do get an extra ending in exclusively the arcade release. If you one credit clear it. And I think all it does is that at the end of the game, you also get to see pictures of the staff. But playing any of the home console releases, we're not going to really see that. Although I think some of the console versions, I mean, like, in the PS2 generation, some of the games, like later in the series or attached to this, do have the arcade releases in them, of course, like the Capcom Fighting Collection type stuff and all that. But I think also, like, I think Streetwise had the first game as an unlockable. And you could probably do that there then. So, the weapons we can wield in the game. There are 3. There's the knife, the katana, and the pipe. The knife is low damage but fast, and you're likely going to throw it at enemies from a distance anyway, so it's good at stunning things. I much prefer the sword and the pipe, as while they are slower, their range is great, and their spammability is even higher. Because when you hit an enemy with it, they're likely going to get stunned backwards, and thus give you a good chance to reset yourself. The unfortunate thing is, while they don't exactly break, if you get hit hard enough while you're holding one of them, they do get destroyed. So, while there's plenty of times you'll just be using it to drain enemy health away like with these Andres, don't be married to the idea of always having one around. On top of the fact, as we saw a moment ago, there's times when you enter a screen, or get to a certain point in the screen where you just drop it automatically because you're either about to see a sort of cutscene, or you're about to go through a screen transition and they don't want you keeping items between that largely. Now, the items that can be dropped by boxes and all that, there's 2 types. There's healing items, which are largely foods, like turkeys, steaks, and all that. But then there's items that are just like gold, like rings and all that. Those are largely just for points. What drops from a thing that has items, I believe, is largely random. There's a couple that are set, like there'll be some that are largely always going to be large health items. But there's sometimes where I swear I break a box open and it's a ring, sometimes it's a knife. It just depends on what's in there. Now, if there is one thing the Sega CD version is very guilty of, and to my memory, so is the Super Nintendo release, slowdown and especially sprite flickering. Not the worst case of it I've ever seen in a game. Mega Man 2 is probably still going to be always at the top of that list, but there are times where it can be very notable. This game, thankfully, tends to keep enough sprites on screen where it largely avoids it, but every now and then, in the case there's something breakable, you're going to run into that, or there's sometimes going to be slowed down based on the amount of them around. Also, there is the timer on screen. That counts down relatively slowly. I don't think I've ever actually gotten a time over in this game. I forget if that's just a death or not. I'm going to say it probably is, and then do research whether or not it actually is between now and the second editing pass, as most beat-em-ups have that be a death, but I'm not exactly certain. For now, though, it's time for the Stage 3 boss. This is Edi.E, or I guess Edi.E. This fight's kinda rough, more for its latter half, as while he throws out some quick punches early on and using his baton to knock you out of jumps, in the latter, like, half or third of his health bar, he starts getting real cautious and sticking to the edges of the arena and firing his gun several times in a row, which is basically impossible to avoid and does very high damage. Worth noting, though, if you don't punch him first, he does an animation where he throws some gum on the ground, and that happens even if you don't punch him first. You can actually grab that gum as a healing item in a pinch, And there's something about that I find disgusting, but also weirdly funny. This boss has enough ways to get around his stuff that it's not the worst, but I'd say this is the last stage in the game before things start just getting a little ridiculous, even on normal mode, as the latter half of the game really wants you dead. Yeah, like the slum, not too bad. The park has some weird stuff, same with the subway. West Side's kind of eh. But the industrial area is where things step up. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 2, we're continuing on through 2 more stages. See you guys then.